Hey Internet, hey YouTube, this is Nate. You can also call me Nathan, but please never call me Nathaniel. And welcome to Monster Train 5 Builds to Make Seraph Cry. So this build is aimed, I would say, primarily at newer players who are struggling to get all the way up to Covenant 25. But of course, veterans, you may also be interested in trying out a few new builds if you haven't tried them already. Probably some of you have seen variations of these builds in the past. But without belaboring the point, let's jump into the guide. So just to ease your minds, we put our best scholar imps on preparing these builds. They have all been Covenant 25 ready tested using the following criteria. These are, I would say, in general, my standard criteria for evaluating a build. If you've seen me on any of my Reddit posts or any of my other videos, you're probably familiar with these three criteria. Criteria number one, the build must be able to clear large frontline or backline units. That means units that have greater than 190 HP as a minimum. The build must be able to access the backline with at least 10 damage. That means access without going through the tanks. So that's either spells or sweep or spikes or some other way of getting directly to the backline units. And three, it must be able to survive all boss relentless phases, and that is especially important for Seraph in Covenant 25, having all of that extra HP. So all these builds that I'm going to show are able to do all three of these things. They can clear large units, they can do backline access, and they can survive Relentless Phase. Just to note, there is one build per clan, so if you're struggling to get a clan win on Covenant 25, maybe try one of these builds, see if you can't overcome that, I don't know, issue. It does cover secondary clan options, so I will be discussing how do you want to flex in some of the secondary clans, what do they provide to the builds, what to avoid, and so on. And I have an example of every single build, a full run of every single build available in the video description, links to my secondary channel, Never Nathaniel Plus. So without further ado, let's get started. First build I want to go over is called the Angriest Prince. So the Angriest Prince is the Hellhorned build that I'm showcasing. Here, the champion of choice is Wrathful 3 or a combination of Wrathful 2 and Brawler 1. So the entire build is designed around growing the rage and armor on the Hornbreaker Prince, scaling him to just insane levels, and then using him as a strong frontline burst and to survive relentless combat. So you scale up the rage to do big damage, you scale up the armor to survive the relentless phases. It does have a couple of weaknesses which are important to highlight. One is this build can struggle to have consistent backline access. That's one of the reasons why flexing in Brawler rather than going all in on Wrathful 3 might make sense in some scenarios. You also need to supplement if you don't take Brawler, and even when you do take Brawler, you'll still likely want to supplement with some form of backline damage, whether that's vents, other AoE spells, or sweep, spikes, any of these that can reach the backline. Can also be an issue at the very beginning, once you've played your Hornbreaker Prince, to make sure you can absorb enough damage to start scaling. If you can't kill that frontline unit with your Hornbreaker Prince, oftentimes you can just die outright. So he'll die, and then you have no big damage unit, you have no scalability. So very important to also consider as you're playing this build, how do I keep my Hornbreaker Prince alive until he's over that threshold where he is consistently killing units and gaining armor. In terms of Seraph, reviewing all three of the current Seraph versions that are available, Chaste is by far the most difficult. In fact, I would even avoid doing this build at all with Seraph the Chaste, because your entire build relies so much on rage. Having your rage halved every turn or every other turn, depending on how many floors you set up, is just brutally detrimental to your build. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you will have to have another form of scaling damage in addition to your champion. You won't be able to rely on him to scale. Seraph the Diligent and Seraph Temperament are about equally difficult. Diligent can make it a little bit awkward getting to the backline units, and then they start putting all those garbage blights in your deck. On the other hand, Temperament is going to lower the damage of your units. Again, if you're relying on sweep as your way to get backline damage, you're really going to struggle against Seraph the Temperament unless you have a consistent way to get rage on those sweep units. Let's start talking unit synergies. So Deranged Brute is, I would say, the top tier unit to flex into this build. He fits very nicely in the same floor as your Hornbreaker Prince, and the additional 3 damage per rage is going to make it so easy to scale him up, get him over that hump where he's starting to kill the frontline units. It's very easy to stack him from there on out. And by himself, if you can get rage on the Deranged Brute, then he also acts as a supplementary damage behind Fledgling Imp. Also very fantastic. It's a way to kind of get a huge boost to the rage on your champion, especially if you can fit it with something like Deranged Brute, your Hornbreaker Prince. Then you fill in that middle slot with a Fledgling Imp, and you're able to scale really, really well. Welder Helper as well, again, as a survival tool for your Hornbreaker Prince. Branded Warrior can work. It's a little bit more difficult because you want to rely on the slay triggers from your Hornbreaker Prince, but oftentimes, you're going to have floors with 2-3 units on them. Having a Branded Warrior behind to be able to pick off some of the back units can scale both of them quite nicely, especially if you get, again, something like Multi-Strike. Quick is not so great on him because you want your Hornbreaker Prince to make sure he's scaling, and if you get Quick on the Branded Warrior, you might end up picking off units before your Hornbreaker Prince can kill them. And finally, I would say this is more of a flex pick, but if you are getting the Fledgling Imp, if you are getting the Welder Helper, then it makes a lot of sense to also throw in a Transcend Imp to get both the armor and rage scaling. When it comes to spells, really anything with rage is going to be fantastic for you. Dark Deal being one of the best ones, because not only do you get the rage from the Dark Deal, you also get the rage from hitting your own unit, which then his revenge trigger gives him even more rage. So you can scale super fast with Dark Deal on the champion. It's a very good way to just kind of get him over those, especially those early high health tanks. Rage Serum, again, just as a way to, really all of these have that same purpose, just to get the Hornbreaker Prince to the point where he's killing frontline units and is then able to sustain off of his own slay triggers. Ritual of Battle, same story. And then Last Stand. Last Stand is a fantastic way. You build up that rage. You have Permafrost on the Last Stand. And then right before Relentless, or at a point where you need to get over some heavy health units, you put in the Last Stand, and all of a sudden you're doing double damage. So Armor, kind of the opposite direction, is a way to supplement that sustain. So Fortify, March of Shields, Alloy of the Ancients, they're all going to help to keep your Prince alive long enough. And then again, highlighting, I would say, one of the best cards in this entire set for this build, Branding Right. If you can get Branding Right, you are going to be thrilled. If you get Branding Right, you not only get to scale the armor, the 20 armor is fantastic on your Hornbreaker Prince, but in addition, doing damage means that you're scaling your rage as well. So it's one of those that if you can get this to 0 cost or 1 cost with double stack, you're going to have no problems sustaining against the Relentless fights with the amount of armor you get and the fact that you're increasing rage. And then finally, similar to Last Stand, what you can often do is get huge armor numbers on your Hornbreaker Prince, and then right before Relentless, or if you're somehow able to remove Consume from it, then you can just keep doubling and doubling and doubling, and you get more or less infinite sustain. But in most cases, you're just going to use it once as a huge increase in armor one time, and that's usually enough to keep your Hornbreaker Prince alive for most Relentless fights. And of course, if you're going to get Rage and Armor, why not get them together? In those cases, you have Inflame. Very standard stuff. One of the best targets for a double stack. Similar with Spike of the Hellhorned, another great target for double stack. With Spike of the Hellhorned, you either want increases in Ember so that you can take advantage of the X cost, or you want something like the first Hell Pact, which is going to give you a strong base on top of whatever Ember you're able to accumulate. Otherwise, I would probably stick with Inflame. Other cards that are synergistic that are outside of the rage and armor. Vent is a fantastic way to do AoE. The only thing you have to be careful about is if you're venting the backliners, those backliners are not attacking your prince, which means that your scaling is getting slowed down. So you want to make sure to only vent when you need to. Probably best is to vent on higher floors than your Hornbreaker Prince after they've already done the damage to him. Imp in a box. We already talked about imps. 3 out of the 5 imps are fantastic with the Hornbreaker Prince. The other ones are also pretty good. So yeah, getting 2 random imps in your hand, especially if they end up being a rage imp or an armor imp, are always going to help you out. One Horn's Tome, and One Horn's Tome, the caveat here is you need to make sure that you have reached that level of sustain where you're never going to get damaged again on your health. You need to be very careful if you're using Branding Right as one of your ways to scale, because if you use the One Horn's Tome, Branding Right is piercing and it will hit your health and kill your champion immediately. So make sure that you don't get both, or that you're fine no longer using Branding Right once you've played the One Horn's Tome. Battering Ram is also something you can flex in if you want to have a huge burst onto a boss. By the time, again, if you put Permafrost on it, you wait until the Relentless phase, and by then you maybe have anywhere from 50 to 150 armor. Well, 4 times that's going to do a huge chunk of damage to most bosses. To be honest, it's not necessary for most of the fights, because by that time, usually the sustain and rage is enough to overcome. But it can be something that you use, especially maybe during Seraph fights, where early on you might not have as much damage, and you can maybe use like an imp, and then all of a sudden you have an 80 damage burst. So it can be useful in certain situations. One important note about Torch. Normally you think about torching the enemies, but actually in this build, it can be beneficial occasionally to torch your champion in order to get him over damage thresholds. So if you have, for example, your base damage 25, you have brawlers, so you have 50 damage, and you have a unit in front that has 60, then you may take 1 damage. That's giving you another 8 damage. Not quite enough to get over the front unit. You torch yourself. Now you're doing 62 damage, getting over the front unit and starting to sustain. So getting into relics, we'll start with the priority relics. First is Collection of Tails. So Collection of Tails makes it so that rage does not decay over time. Fantastic synergy with your Hornbreaker Prince. He's going to get a lot of rage, but then one of the issues is that over time that rage goes away. You get the Collection of Tails. Now you don't have to worry about that rage going away. Next, we have the Resonant Shard. Very similar to the Deranged Brute. It's a way to scale up the amount of damage you do due to rage. So fantastic. Changes it from +2 damage per rage to +3 damage per rage. Even combined with the Deranged Brute, now you're doing +6 damage per rage. So it's another way to scale up a lot faster. We also have the Railhammer. Railhammer is going to be really synergistic with his Slay Trigger. An additional 4 armor per Slay Trigger, especially when you're on Wrathful 1, Wrathful 2. That's going to make a huge difference in how much sustain you're getting out of your Hornbreaker Prince as he's slaying frontline enemies. Last, we have Consumed Crown. Consumed Crown is another scaling, and one of the nice things about the scaling here, especially if you end up going against something like Seraph the Chaste, is even if you are losing your rage stacks, you're getting base damage on top. Now, if we go into some situational relics, we start with Impsicle. Again, talking about imp synergies, having an imp every single turn can be really helpful for either giving more sustain with armor, getting more rage with rage imps. If you were super lucky, you get a Transcend imp, you can take benefit from all of them. Even the Ember can occasionally be useful because some of the rage and armor spells cost a lot. Some of the consumed ones, cost 3 or 2 Ember to use. So not gonna be upset too much with having free imps every turn. The Ashes of the Fallen, again, I would say this is situational. You really need it with some imps in play, but you get the Ashes of the Fallen, suddenly you're getting 40 armor, you're getting 6 rage. That scaling increases even more. Scorching Restraints can be a way to get a quick uptick in your rage early on, and it can also help with a lot of the back units who are supporting the Hornbreaker Prince. For example, you get that on the Deranged Brute, and suddenly he's able to do an additional 15 damage, right? So this can be really helpful, again, to get a quick uptick on your Hornbreaker Prince, but it's also especially useful for the backline units who take advantage of that early rage. We have the Split Anvil. So Split Anvil becomes very useful when you have high cost spells. So you get, either holdover or you get permafrost on one of those 3 cost spells. You wait to play it until the opportune moment, and then suddenly all the rest of your spells are free. So it can be a way to get a lot of spells out in a single turn. I would say it really depends on how your deck is set up. But if you are set up where you have a couple of 3 costs that you can consistently play and then a lot of 1 costs, that's a really great way to get all those spells out every turn. And last, I mentioned this already, but the first Hell Pact as well, if you're getting the Spike of the Hellhorned, is incredibly important for getting that scaling to increase and to make sure that even if you're playing at the end of turn, you're still getting value out of that Spike of the Hellhorned. Let's talk about secondary clans, starting with Awoken. I've showed this in one of my previous guide videos with interactions with spikes, but really I can't emphasize enough, getting spikes on the Hornbreaker Prince with Wrathful is one of the most powerful interactions in the game. There's very few things that scale as hard and scale as consistently as a spiked Hornbreaker Prince with Wrathful. Because the way the interaction works is Slay triggers also consider spikes and revenge triggers. So as those units, especially those 1-2 health units that are hitting your Hornbreaker Prince, as they're dying, you're scaling. You're scaling your armor, you're scaling your rage, and this especially becomes important where some of the fights you have a bunch of small, low health minions up front, and then a big tank in the back. Well, all those low health minions die, increase your rage, giving you more likely of a chance that you can kill the backline unit with the Hornbreaker Prince during his combat phase. If you don't get actual spike spells, you can also use the Thorned Hollow as a backup. So you play the Hornbreaker Prince in one room. You play the Thorned Hollow in a separate room, and it works as like cleanup, right? So if Hornbreaker Prince kills the front unit and maybe some of 1 or 2 extra units, and then the rest of them get picked off by the Thorned Hollow. It's also a good target for those heals, because the Hornbreaker Prince, you're very unlikely to play heals on him because he scales more with armor than with health. Then you have a target for all of those restores that you start with as the Awoken. If you can't get spikes, you can get sweep. Just be very cautious if you're relying on sweep around Seraph the Temperant, because those sweep units have very low base damage numbers, very easy to get sapped out to 0, and then you don't have any backline access. So you either need a way to scale them, a way to get them rage, a way to get them, consume crown can do that if they actually are killing backline units, but you need some way of making sure that they can scale up through the rest of the battle. And then if you don't have anything else, in addition to having Vent, you can always Glimmer, right? So you add 10 magic damage to Glimmer. That's going to take out most backline units with up to 10 health, right? Going into Stygian Guard, Frostbite is pretty good in general in combination with the Prince. The nice thing about Frostbite is if you have a Frostbite attack that doesn't actually kill the unit, the Frostbite doesn't act immediately. So then you get the benefit of having all of those units attacking into your Prince. The Frostbite trigger happens at the end of turn, and you get the benefit from both, right? So you kill all the units, but you also get to scale your Hornbreaker Prince. And speaking of sweep units, exactly, having an upgraded sweep unit, again, clearing out the backline, just be very cautious about the scaling on the damage in case you're going against Seraph the Temperant. Okay, incants. So I would say one of the best is to get a Guardian Stone that can incant. You put that on the same floor as your Hornbreaker Prince. Now all these spells you're using to improve your Hornbreaker Prince, all those rage triggers, armors, and so on, also give extra armor on top, which is going to help with a lot of that sustain. Another is the Nameless Siren. Nameless Siren takes advantage of all of those rage bonuses. So you get a Deranged Brute, the Hornbreaker Prince, and a Nameless Siren, and now you're raging up to 11. So yeah, you want to make sure you're taking units that are taking advantage of your base scaling. One thing you need to be very careful about is sap. With sap, you are very likely to reduce the damage of the enemy units below or to 0. If you're doing that, your Hornbreaker Prince doesn't scale. Let's go into Umbra. Umbra, I mean, the Emberdrain package, right? The Emberdrain package fits super nicely with the Hornbreaker Prince. You're getting Rage, you're getting Multi-Strike, you're getting Lifesteal. All of these things benefit pretty well with the Hornbreaker Prince. The one that you might not want to include is Void Binding, because Void Binding provides damage shield, and damage shield prevents revenge triggers. So you won't actually scale the Rage from taking damage from enemies while you have damage shield on your champion. Doesn't mean you can't use it, but I would just be cautious to make sure that you can scale enough, even if you are blocking some of the hits with damage shield. In addition to the Rage, some excellent additions is you have Trample. Getting Trample on your Hornbreaker Prince. You can then actually go Wrathful 3 pretty consistently, and I would recommend, if you get the chance to add Trample to your champion, you go Wrathful 3. He will scale immensely. He will never die with the armor that he gets, and he'll scale very fast with the Rage. Excavation Eruption is also pretty good for clearing out backline units and getting you Ember. Mind Collapse, very similar. They just need to be upgraded. And then in terms of Gorge units, you want to avoid a lot of the standard tanky ones, because your Hornbreaker Prince is likely to be your tank and likely to be a lot of your relentless damage. But if you need an AoE option or a backline option, then Shadow Eater is really great, right? So you have Shadow Eater, you only need 1 or 2 morsels behind him, and you're clearing almost every single backline. And finally, Melting Remnant. I would say Melting Remnant is probably the more difficult one to pair with the Hornbreaker or with the Angriest Prince build, mostly due to the spells. The spells don't really synergize that well with what you're trying to do with this particular build. However, there are some units you can take that can help. I would say the best one is Big Sludge. So putting Big Sludge behind your champion, he's getting all the benefit from any rage bonuses that you get. And, you know, the whole goal is to get kills off of your Hornbreaker Prince. If you're killing things with the Hornbreaker Prince, then your Big Sludge is gaining rage. So those two work pretty well. I mean, other units you can always include are like Stalker, Legion. You just need to make sure, Bounty Stalker, Legion of Wax, you just need to make sure that you have the appropriate upgrades or relics that support those units. But that's, I would say, standard with all builds. So with all of that out of the way, why don't we take a quick look at a short highlight from my Angriest Prince run that I did recently. Okay, so just to give some background, this is the Seraph fight early on in the Seraph fight. I just want to show off a few turns and show exactly how this one plays. In this case, we have Awoken as our secondary, so the idea is to get spikes on our champion so that he is able to kill backliners on his own and take advantage of those slay triggers. Let's just watch a little bit of it. So we get Sharpen, that's killing off the backline units. We get Branding Right, scaling our armor and damage. We can even heal some of the damage we took from Branding Right. And we get in that Fledgling Imp to increase the rage even more, helping us get up to the point where we're killing that frontline unit. And again, with the second set of units, we're killing everything. We're getting, you can see already, we're actually healing a little bit. Or we're at least sustaining through all the damage. We can heal back some of the damage we're taking with our healing spells, and continuing to scale up damage and armor from the revenge triggers and slate triggers. Yeah, we're in really great shape now. Let's watch one more fight. Same thing. And you can see already after 3 turns, we're sitting at close to 150 damage per hit. After this turn, it's going to be much over 150 damage per hit after 3 turns of combat. So he scales just insanely well. It's a pretty consistent build as long as you have the right support. And with spikes, we don't have any issues with the backline units. Okay, moving on to our next build, we have the Spiked Awoken. This is our Awoken build, as you can tell by the name. Champion of choice here is Bristling 3. You don't really want to mix up the Sentient very often, and especially when you're going spikes, you really want all 3 upgrades to get those 40 spikes. Core strategy is you use the Sentient as sustained backline access using spikes, and you get heavy burst via support units. Strengths are you have guaranteed access to backline with a high health pool tank. On the other side, the weaknesses are it can be difficult to burst high health units. You really have to get some strong, high damage support units. And you also need sustain for relentless combat, even if you consider the 120 health, it's really high health, but that's basically 4 rounds of combat with Seraph and your sentient's already dead unless you have some form of sustain. In terms of Seraph difficulty, again, the Chaste is by far the most difficult, with your spikes getting halved every turn or every other turn, depending on the number of rooms you are covering. Seraph the Diligent is by far the easiest. You're able to kill off very easily the backline units that are creating garbage in your deck. They overall have lower damage. And then if you consider the Temperate, it's also fairly straightforward. The Temperate cannot, lower your damage less than 0, but you are relying on support units to do a lot of damage, and there the Temperate becomes difficult. If you have like an Animus or something like that, it's going to get sapped to oblivion. So what are the main units? I already mentioned 2 of them. Animus of Speed, Animus of Will. They are going to be your core Awoken damage dealers. Risk with both of them is that they get sapped. The benefit of both of them is that they scale quite well with upgrades, enhancements, and so you can actually scale their damage pretty well. You get a large stone on either one of them, it's pretty strong. If you get multi-strike on Animus of Speed, it's pretty strong. If you get quick and large stone on Animus of Will, it's pretty strong. But again, just be cautious about how Seraph the Temperate will sap their damage. Shard Channeler is another excellent addition. It's going to more or less double your base spikes damage. So now if you have the Bristling 3, instead of doing 40 damage to every unit, you're doing 80 damage to every unit as they attack your sentients. That can be really strong. Awoken Hollow and Thorned Hollow can also be quite good to supplement. Awoken Hollow can go actually behind your sentient. He has his own strong health pool, takes advantage of all the heals, and he can scale up at a decent rate, but not, to be honest, very fast. The main benefit here is that you then have a second tank to work around. Thorned Hollow can also be quite good in case you want to scale up a second spike unit. It may seem strange, why would you want 2 of them? But there are some cases where having a secondary tank can be very useful, and in fact the run that I'll showcase has both a Thorned Hollow and the Sentient included. In terms of spell synergies, all of your regen spells, so Wildwood Sap, Spreading Spores, and Awake, are fantastic choices in addition to your restores that you start with. One note about specifically Spreading Spores, this is a fantastic card to include against Seraph the Diligent, because even if it gets consumed, it's creating more copies and you basically never run out of spells, which can be a problem sometimes with Seraph the Diligent. With Awake, you have the strongest healing out of a regen spell in that's available in the deck. But in general, the idea is to stack enough regen to sustain all of the damage. In terms of scaling, you want things like Steel Enhancer, Razor Sharp Edge, and Sharpen. Those will all scale up the damage on your Animus or any other multi-striking unit that's going to be behind your Sentient. Sharpen can also increase the amount of spikes damage the enemies are taking, but I would recommend that you pair Sharpen with another form of spike scaling, like additional spike damage, because really the 40 is going to be enough to kill the backliners. More important then is the damage burst you're getting with multi-strike. And finally, you have Cycle of Life, which is scaling both your health and your spikes. It's a good option to get, if you don't have a lot of regen, you can scale up your life quite high, and that can work as a way to balance out some of the relentless fights. Other things to consider: Unleash the Wildwood. Especially if you don't have a lot of regen, having a holdover on Unleash the Wildwood acts as regen up until the relentless fights. You still need to be cautious about Relentless, but this can help to get you back to full health every time after every combat. Restoration Detonation, it comes with the bonus of not only healing your unit, but doing damage to the enemy units. So it can be a way to get a lot of burst. If you add, for example, 10, 20 magic damage to it, suddenly you're doing 100 to 200 damage. So it can be really, really strong on this type of build to get a huge burst onto a front enemy unit. Bramble Lash as well. You get Bramble Lash with holdover. Most units can't survive as long as you have a 20 spike unit up front. You're going to kill any unit that is in the front line. Big thing to consider with Bramble Lash is Relentless phase again. On most Relentless bosses, it's going to be fine. On Seraph, you can't really rely on Bramble Lash because he's always going to come with chumps in front. So being able to Bramble Lash him becomes really difficult unless you have multiple Bramble Lashes or some way of killing or removing frontline units to get access to Seraph. And then Restoring Retreat. One great strategy with this build is to stack a floor, especially for the Relentless phases. If you have 3 or 4 damaging units behind your Sentient, it's going to be a lot easier to do enough damage during that Relentless phase and kill the bosses. In terms of relics, the Petrified Crucible is very, very beneficial for this build. Being able to double your spike damage effectively for the rest of the game is certainly going to help. Also with bursting out units, it helps with Relentless phases. And of course, if you have some higher health backline units, you're more likely to be able to take them out with just spikes. Bloating Fungus is another fantastic relic to help with more on the sustain side. You get Bloating Fungus. Suddenly your Awake is doing 6 heal per turn instead of just 3. Can really help against the Relentless phase against Seraph. With you don't need nearly as much regen to get as much benefit out of that regen. Split Anchor, again, similar to Hellhorned. You have a lot of 3-cost spells. If you can organize your deck correctly, you can play a 3-cost spell almost every turn, then play your 2 costs and 1 cost for free. And this is one of those builds where playing a lot of heals is going to help tremendously with your sustain, as well as being able to upgrade units with enhances or any other cards that are boosting their scaling. On the more situational side, I would put Gnarled Root. You may think Gnarled Root is like an obvious choice, and what I would say is it can be extremely helpful, but you want to make sure you're pairing it with a spell that's granting spikes. On its own, you're only just getting 1 spike on your Sentient or 1 additional spike per Thorned Hollow stack, but then if you use it with Sharpen or use it with Cycle of Life, that's where you're really taking benefit from the Gnarled Root. So you really need to have one of those cards first before Gnarled Root becomes really effective. Next is Sap Tap. Sap Tap is a great way to get card draw. You're often going to be healing, even if it's at the end of turn, that will still give you an extra card for the next turn. So in general, having extra card draw is always going to benefit, and this is one of those builds that you're pretty consistently going to get restore triggers. Root Split Mask is also a very good option. You put your Sentient on the top floor rather than the bottom, which I would say is more normal for this build, but you put your Sentient in the top floor. Now the enemies are getting rooted and they're taking double spike damage. You pair that with the Petrified Crucible, now they're taking quadruple spike damage. So being able to have your Sentient effectively hit twice is going to be a big benefit. I would say the only thing you need to worry about here is, do you have enough sustain to support your Sentient taking that much damage? Because you might end up having a floor with 6 or 7 units on it, all damaging your Sentient, and especially early game when the health total is not quite so high, could be really dangerous. And last, we have Priory's Cloak. This is another, I would say, pretty decent relic. The main benefit here is if you combine it with Unleash the Wildwood and you allow your Sentient to take a lot of damage before you do Unleash the Wildwood, you can get really, really massive bursts onto front enemy units. It's also good in general. Oftentimes you'll have that situation that I discussed earlier where you have a lot of small units that maybe do a lot of damage, like their stealth or something like that. Being able to just kind of pick them off a little bit at a time with a restore also can become very valuable at protecting the health on your Sentient. Looking at secondary clans, I'll start with the Hellhorned. Talk about demons. Demons are a great replacement for your Animus units. They typically have high damage. If you're looking at like Demon Fiend, Horned Warrior, Consumer of Crowns, get multi-strike on one of them, and it's going to be much easier to burst out a big tanky unit in the front and do a lot of damage during relentless fights. Rage can also in general work with demons as long as you have the proper supporting spells and the proper supporting artifacts or relics. Combined with Restoring Retreat, it's quite easy to overstack when you have Hellhorned. In fact, it might even be easier because Hidden Passage is cheaper, and that's a way that you can stack up a lot of demons or animuses or whatever behind your Sentient to prepare for relentless fights, especially for defeating Seraph. So yeah, definitely consider with this build overstacking. It's a fantastic way to take advantage of that high health pool and sustain with supporting damage. Next up is Stygian Guard. First, let's talk about Incants. You play a lot of restores, restoring spells, and even zero-cost spells with the Awoken. So getting Incants on the same floor as your Sentient can help to scale extremely well. What you'll want is to make sure you have multi-strike. You'll want to have plenty of cheap spells. The one thing you want to avoid, very similar to the Angriest Prince build, you are relying on spikes. So Lodestone Totem could be actually detrimental. You're going to reduce their damage to 0. Now these backline units aren't dying. But getting either one of the Nameless Siren or Siren of the Sea is going to be fantastic for scaling against the bosses and to scale up against tanky frontliners. When considering whether to go Frostbite or Spell Weakness to support your Spiked Awoken build, pick one. Don't pick both. And what I would say as a rule of thumb is Frostbite tends to be better against the Relentless combat because you're able to stack the Frostbite quite a lot. So if you get something like Cold Celia, she'll stack a lot of Frostbite on the boss and then take all that damage as he's trying to get through the Sentient's high health total. With Spell Weakness, that's going to typically be much better against tanky frontline units who don't require massive amounts of damage, but just like a little bit extra damage, and then that Spell Weakness will help to burst them out. So you might want to try to decide what's more important for you or where are you struggling the most, and then pick the units and spells accordingly. Going into Umbra, I would say Umbra is probably the hardest one to combine with the Spiked Awoken. The main reason why is that all the Gorgers want to be on the front line, but so does your Sentient. And having a huge tank without the Gorge minion behind the tank, it's not really the best possible setup. It's like you have two different tanks that both want to be there. Emberdrain package can work pretty well with both Animus, so Animus of Will or Animus of Speed. So that actually is a pretty good option, is that you have the Sentient up front, you have one of the Animus behind, and then you stack it with all of the Emberdrain package. You just got to be cautious around being able to continue to sustain your Sentient. Similar to with the Hellhorned, you might also consider overstacking. And in fact, one of the things you can do is have a Gorger, have that Gorger set up on a higher room than the Sentient. You have it gorge for 6-7 turns, however many turns you can before the Relentless phase, and then right before the Relentless phase, you drop it down behind the Sentient with either Cave-In or Restoring Retreat. And finally, we have Melting Remnant. Harvest is a really good synergy with Spikes, because you could have a Harvest unit sitting behind your Sentient. All the units that die immediately benefit the Harvest unit, which then attacks. So if you have something like Big Sludge, you have a Big Sludge with Multi-Strike, you get 3 or 4 stacks of Rage, 3 or 4 Harvest stacks of Rage on him, and then he gets to attack. That can be really good at bursting down frontline enemy units. And it works really well with Relentless because you'll have all that time to build up the Harvest stacks and then fight the bosses. Another thing to consider with Melting Remnant is getting Endless on the Sentient. Unless you are planning on scaling hard with spikes, like really adding a lot of spikes, the 40 spikes or 20 spikes or whatever the base spikes is on your Sentient tends to be really strong during Relentless phases. If you get a Remnant Pact, you put it on the Sentient dies, well, he's back again on the second floor, and then he's back again on the third floor. So you can take advantage of all that health pool, all of those spikes, and hit the boss multiple times with the same unit. Another good combo is Bounty Stalker. Bounty Stalker with Endless works fantastic in this build. What you can do is stack him up quite nicely on second or third floors, and then bring him down to the first floor at the very end, where he's going to do a whole lot of damage to the boss. And if you get Endless on both of them, well, then you get Bounty Stalker and the Sentient moving up together with the boss. Okay, so that's an overview of the build. Let's jump into now a highlight, and we can show how this build operates early on in the Seraph fight. Okay, just to set this up, in this highlight we're going to show the early part of a Seraph fight. Again, the idea is that we have the Sentient up front. We're going to put damage dealers behind. In this case, we have an Animus of Will and an Animus of Speed. We also have a Shard Channeler to increase the spikes damage, and several enabling spells to increase the scaling on our different Animuses. So let's watch. We're putting down the Sentient first. On the bottom floor, put the Shard Channeler behind to double the damage. Get a Razor Sharp Edge to already increase the scaling on our Animus of Will. And then just putting out a morsel to have it out there. Here, as I mentioned, we have a Thorned Hollow. We can put it up there up top just to clean up some additional units. This is one of those cases where getting the Thorned Hollow as well as a Sentient is a lot of benefit, because we can kill off anything that gets through those first few rounds. We also got a Crucible extension to not overstack, but to put a lot of units. That's what I was mentioning earlier. Having a lot of units on the same floor of your Sentient means that the amount of damage that's going to be done is going to be even higher. We used Unleash the Wildwood, as mentioned, to do a big burst into the front unit, and then we're killing off all the backliners with the spikes. Let's watch one more once we get through this last little bit of combat. And you see there's a huge, massive damage potential on that bottom floor, and here the idea is just to take advantage of that. Even though we're getting sapped, we have scaling with our enhancements to keep our units damaging enough to survive through the Relentless phase and to eventually kill off most of these units and kill off the Seraph. Alright, on to the third build. This is the ultimate Incant floor build, the Stygian Guard build of the guide. Here, the champion of choice is Conduit 3 for the -3 spell cost. You can also flex in 1 Frostbite at the end, depending on how your setup goes, but normally you do all Conduit 3 to try to get free damage spells. The core strategy here is to scale your Incant units using cost-reduced AoE and burst spells. The main strengths of the build are you have great frontline burst and backline access with your damage spells, a lot of broad AoE spells, a lot of huge frontline burst spells are available. Main weaknesses is scaling to overcome Seraph can be quite tough unless you have a lot of either Incant synergies going or a lot of spells, a lot of draw. And totems can be pretty expensive to play, which might slow down the early parts of the fights, and you could get overrun with units before you're able to start really scaling your units and your Incant totems. In terms of Seraph difficulty, Chaste is pretty straightforward. The only thing you have to worry about is the Rage stacks and Frostbite stacks. Seraph Diligent can be a little bit more difficult because you're losing your spells, which are the main source of damage and the main source of incanting. Temperament, I would say, is moderately difficult. The biggest issue with Temperament can be the early part of the match, where you haven't been able to scale so hard. As well, the other issue with the Temperament is the backliners that do 2 times 15 damage can really blast through your tanks very quickly from the very start of the fight before you've had a chance to scale up armor or sap or any of those other things. Going into the unit synergies, definitely you're going to want to get the 2 main Sirens, the Nameless Siren and Siren of the Sea. Very important core staples. Getting multi-strike on them, scaling them up is one of the main core components of the build. Guard of the Unnamed is a standard frontliner for the build due to his armor gain on Incant. You don't have to have him. There are other frontliners you can use, but he's I would say the typical standard frontliner. Guardian Stone is a really big benefit for the entire floor. Helps everybody stay alive a lot longer. Can really make sure that you survive against AoE and other types of issues you make, spikes as well, any types of issues that normally your backliners die to. Offering Monument, it helps because you get all the card draw, which means you're playing more spells, which means you're probably going to burst out all the units on that floor and get more incants for the units on your side on the floor. And then Glacial Seal and Slowstone Totem, both providing Frostbite and Sap respectively, which again are great ways to deal with Relentless, but they also help with surviving against other floors as well. In terms of spell synergies, you have the main damage spells, so Ice and Pyre, Ice Storm, Helical Crystallis, Crypt Builder, Ice Tornado, Titan's Tooth, and Ancient Synergy. Generally, the more damage, the better. So since you are getting free spells, you don't need to do cost reduction on any of them, which can be a little bit tricky in the first, I would say, 3 or 4 floors. But once you get Conduit level 2, it becomes much easier to play out these 3-cost spells. Very important, especially on things like Ice Storm, Ancient Synergy, Helical Crystallis, Icy Tornado to increase the damage. Titan's Tooth, you can increase the Frostbite with double stack. Holdover on a lot of these spells becomes really useful. Ice and Pyre is situational. If you have the relic to support it, you can use it. I typically don't play my Incant floor on the top floor, but if you do, then Ice and Pyre can be really helpful there as well. And then you have, I would say, the more damage spell scaling, which is Harness the Titan, right? So you harness the Titan, you minus the cost to 0, and you get it on holdover. It's going to benefit all of your damage spells, helping to scale up that damage, helping with burst, backline cleanup, and so forth. And by itself, it's a great incant. It's easy to get 0 cost on it, and then every turn you're getting that incant as well. In terms of utility, Preserve, to be able to save a card for later. And the nice thing is when you play the Preserve, it also incants. It's a 0 cost incant. Frenzied Swarm, get it down to 0. What's also great about the discard mechanic is that discarded offering cards are considered played. So even though you're discarding them, if they are an offering, they get played as if you had played them from your hand. So you get the benefit of the incant as well on any discarded offering cards. Siren Song is a great way to deal with, especially I would say earlier in the run, dealing with high health units that are difficult to burst through. It's obviously not so great with Seraph, but on all other fights it's going to be really useful. Deep Offering, similar to Frenzied Swarm, you discard your whole hand, which could be great for triggering all your offering spells. But the main reason to get Deep Offering is to make it free and then be able to get a really huge turn by drawing 5. I don't typically remove Consume on it. I typically just try to make it 0 or 1 cost and then use it for the draw. Gifts for a Guard, you can draw 3 spells, enhance them with extra magic power. They do get Consume. However, there is a interesting interaction where if you have removed Consume from one of your spells and then you do Gifts for a Guard on it, that Consume removal also blocks the Consume from Gifts for a Guard. So you can actually scale up some of your spells really strong. And it's a good incant. It's a good way to draw 3 damage spells. And yeah, the only thing you have to worry about is potentially consuming some of your spells earlier than you want. Okay, so then getting into relic synergies, we have our priority relics with the Founding Seal. Definitely the highest priority relic you can get. Doubling your incants just makes everything scale faster, puts Frostbite on faster, puts Sap on faster, adds the armor up faster. Everything is going to benefit from the Founding Seal and the extra incant. Totem Fragment can be really useful for getting extra burst onto bosses and onto high health frontliners. If you get it, then there's a lot of incentive to play up on the top floor, even though you get stunned, and even though occasionally you're going to have capacity restriction there. Playing in that top floor means that those damage spells are going to do even more damage on the units as well as the bosses. Similar to that, we have the Tethys Scales. Tethys Scales grants 50% chance of getting spell weakness. Again, now you have the freedom to play wherever, but there's that chance that every once in a while you'll get enemy units or enemy bosses that have spell weakness. You can take advantage of that by doing a big burst on them when they show up. A Forgotten Name, which acts as another scale for your damage spells. Every time you play 3 spells in a turn, which you're going to do basically every turn, you get extra magic power, and that is Really, most important for any of your multi-damage units, so Icy Tornado, Ancient Synergy, Helical Crystallis. These are all going to take benefit from having the extra tick of damage per hit. And after, 5-6 turns, that actually adds up quite a lot. You can do a lot of damage to enemy units and to bosses. Now moving into more of the situational relics, we have Icicle Fracture, very similar to Preserve, being able to keep cards in your hand that you don't play right away, but then you might want later, especially high damage burst spells for Relentless phases, or non-damage spells that you want to use for utility. Being able to keep them in your hand until they become more relevant can be very helpful in certain builds. Titan's Claw can also be very useful. You might think, well, why are we using Titan's Claw if we're going to have all of our damage spells become 0 cost? Actually, one of the main benefits of using Titan's Claw is to reduce the cost on frozen units. So if you get Preserve, you can preserve one of your totems, especially like the Lodestone Totem or the Glacial Seal, and then this relic will reduce their cost to 0. You can play them out much easier without that high cost restriction. It's also very useful for a lot of the other spells which are not going to be reduced, like the utility spells, then making them a lot more playable as well. Volatile Gauge. This is one of the only builds that I would say consistently works with Volatile Gauge. The fact that most of your damage spells are going to be 0 by the end anyway, and if you're stacking a lot of 3-cost spells, even before you get Conduit 3, you're going to really take advantage of the cost reduction coming from Tethys. So you just get more cards per turn. So you play more spells per turn, so you incant more per turn. Really, really good option for a deck like this. If you start with it, honestly, if you're playing in general and you get it in your opening relic draw, and you have Conduit as an option, you take it. It's a really strong combo. And then finally, we have Forever Flame, very similar to Titan's Claws. Forever Flame is an option to reduce the unit cost, making it much easier to play out those expensive totems, those other units, without having to use all of your Ember. And really, with this build, you want to avoid taking extra Ember. So all these ones that can help reduce Ember cost, or can, especially with units, reduce the unit costs, becomes very, very useful for the run. Okay, let's talk secondary clans. So Hellhorned, the biggest synergy you're going to want is Rage. Nameless Siren gets a lot of benefit out of any other Rage synergies that you can provide. And in general, Rage spells are a great way to scale up all of your other units, especially units that have multi-strike. In addition to the Rage, armor can get really crazy, especially if you get Railhammer. Railhammer will just make your Incant armor go nuts. So if you happen to get any of the armor incants from the shop and you have Railhammer, all of a sudden that's a completely broken upgrade. In addition, all of the low-cost armor spells are really good incants. A lot of them are 0 or 1 cost. Play them very easily to continue to scale and incant. For Awoken, both of the hollows work quite well as a frontline tank for an incant floor. You will have to increase capacity to make room for them, and so you want one of them, Tethys, and another incanter like Siren of the Sea or the Nameless Siren. The main advantage here is that you have all of those restores and regen spells that you're playing in combination with one another. Then you get all of these incants off of the regen, incants off of the restores, and all the units are taking benefit as you're stacking up that regen on your frontline tank. One special synergy with Awoken is Adaptive Mutation. If you happen to get Adaptive Mutation with a Nameless Siren, go for every single spell upgrade you can and pray that you get Consume Removal, because that combination is absolutely nuts. The way that the interaction works is, so Adaptive Mutation swaps health and damage, but it's considering your current buffs. So if you have buffs due to Rage, then your health will become your damage plus Rage. Your damage becomes your previous health, and then your Rage stacks on top of it. If you do it multiple times, you get that same that same exchange once again, and all of a sudden you're very easily scaling to units that have 500-600 health and 500-600 damage. It's really crazy interaction. If you haven't done it yet, highly recommend. It's a really fun and hilarious way to play this run. When it comes to Umbra, one of the best things of Umbra is they have really good AoE damage spells with Excavation Eruption and Blazing Bolts. With Excavation Eruption, you get -1 cost. Now you have a 0 cost 20/4 damage spell that gains Ember on killing units. You also have 2, I would say, mediocre damage spells, Mind Collapse and Forever Consumed. They do take advantage of a lot of the magic damage increase options that you have, but they are not taking advantage of the spell cost reduction that you get from Tethys, which is why I put them more in the mediocre category. But what can be really cool is if you have something like Excavation Eruption and Forever Consumed, you use the Excavation Eruption in order to gain a bunch of Ember, and then you use all that Ember in a Forever Consumed to blast the front unit. So there are some combinations that work really well, but in particular, if you can get Excavation Eruption and Blazing Bolts, you'll be really happy with this build. When it comes to the Emberdrain package, there is some synergy, but one of the biggest problems you might have is early game before you hit Conduit 3, having Emberdrain is going to really slow down your incanting. So I think you need to be quite cautious with Emberdrain. It can work, again, extremely well late game. It's fantastic for scaling your Sirens, but you need to make sure that you're not doing it too much early, or you have the risk that you can't play any of your 3-cost damage spells, which is a core part of this build. And finally, we have Melting Remnant. Easily the most difficult to combine with this build. However, this is the showcase is Stygian Guard Melting Remnant, and we were able to manage it. There are some interesting infinite combos you can do. So Offering Monument plus Reform, you can scale the damage on Offering Monument to just insane levels, and the fact that you are potentially redrawing that Reform over and over again can be really good. In order to make it work properly, you actually do need to have double Offering Monuments, so that one dies, you reform this while you reform one, you play it, you reform it, it draws the reform, then it dies. So there is some like kind of quirkiness to that combo, but it is a way to get infinite scaling on your incants. I think more practically, there are 3 damage spells in the Melting Remnant: a Fatal Melting, Memento Mori, and Mortal Entrapment. Mortal Entrapment by itself is playable. It's a 3 cost damage spell. You can reduce it down to 0 easily with Conduit 3, and it does stun. The one important caveat to Mortal Entrapment is you have to have a damaged unit, but honestly, with the amount of damage spells you're going to have, finding a unit to hit with Mortal Entrapment is not going to be hard. Memento Mori and a Fatal Melting are much easier to play. However, they do scale off of units that are dying. So what can be beneficial, and you'll see this in the showcase build, is having a couple endless units that you can just continue to rotate on a separate floor and have them die pretty consistently to scale up Memento Mori and Fatal Melting. So with that, let's go and show the showcase build. We will show a highlight of the Seraph fight very early on to just demonstrate how you set it up and how this build can work. Okay, so again, this is the showcase build. We have Tethys Titan's Bane, we have both Sirens, we have a Titan Sentry on a separate floor. We also have some endless units to scale up some of the Melting Remnant damage, and you can kind of get an idea for how we play this one out. So we're going to start with putting the Titan Sentry on the bottom floor. This was mainly just to clean up a lot of the backline units before they're going to put a lot of damage onto Tethys. We're going to already start scaling as much damage as we can onto Seraph. Now we're able to draw the Titan Sentry again because the Titan Sentry has Endless. We're also able to draw the Nameless Siren and start scaling it up. I think we end up putting the Titan Sentry on the middle floor, if I'm not mistaken, just to block some of the damage and then have it die. But maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe we actually just allow some damage on our unit. Yeah, it looks like we do. We do put extra Frostbite onto Seraph. We toss the Titan Sentry down there. It's going to die, but it'll come right back because that's Endless. And now we're going to start setting up the rest of our incants on that floor. So there's the other Siren. There's our Guardian Stone. With Guardian Stone, especially if you want it to tank, very important is to get that health stone on it so that it can survive the first few hits. And it looks like we are, basically set up to do some extra damage, try to kill off that Gilded Wing before it does too much to us. We're going to take a little bit of damage from this top unit, but otherwise we're looking really good. We'll watch one more turn just to kind of, again, demonstrate how the build is working. Now that we have all of our units set up properly, it's really about making sure that we are stacking up as much as possible. We have these 2 endless units, and again, those endless units are just there. 1, to kill off backliners to reduce the damage on our Incant floor, and 2, to provide a way for us to scale up Memento Mori, which ends up being a really, really strong burst spell for us later on. Other thing, I didn't mention this, but especially against Seraph, the Temperant, one of the great things about Melting Remnant is Melting Remnant has resin removal, and you'll see that being very helpful for us here with allowing us to get all of our damage back right away. All right, for the 4th build, we have Umbra with the Emberdrain package. Now, I've mentioned this a few times, but let me highlight the build kind of designed around the Emberdrain package. The champion of choice here is Monstrous 3. The main reason is Monstrous 3 has the highest base stats, and with this build, we're not really looking to have tons of units or really gorging very much. The whole idea is to take your Monstrous Penumbra and just buff him up to insane levels. So the core strategy, again, scale Penumbra using the Emberdrain package spells. The main strength here is you have high frontline burst, and you get that right from the beginning from Penumbra's base stats, with extreme scaling potential due to the cards that come in the Emberdrain package. What are the main weaknesses? Well, Blights become a huge problem with this build. Not always, but can be. With Blights, you're going to have 0 Ember every turn, and even though all your spells cost 0 Ember, well, these Blights don't. And you can die to Blights. It's happened to me before, especially if you're playing against Seraph the Diligent and you have all those Blight units coming through. Well, it can be pretty easy to die to Blights even if you're not leaking units. The second issue is you have limited backline access in the early game before you're able to scale Penumbra up high enough that he's killing the frontline units, and before you get access to a lot of the rare cards. So you really need to find ways to survive through about Daedalus or floor 5 or 6. That's going to be the most difficult part to get through. It tends to be that later on in the game you have all the tools you need to survive floor 7 and Seraph. In terms of difficulty, Seraph the Chaste is probably moderately easy. You do have the issue that Seraph the Chaste will remove your rage, but it's not the only way you scale, right? So you scale through multi-strike, you scale through, basically that's it. You can scale through multi-strike, you can scale through protecting yourself with damage shield, lifesteal. By the time that Seraph gets there, oftentimes you have scaled to the point where it's no longer a problem anymore. Diligence a little bit more difficult because the Emberdrain package relies on continuing to stack, and the Diligent blocks that in a couple of ways. 1, you get all of the Blights in your deck, and 2, your cards are going to get consumed. So if you're relying on a lot of Void Bindings or a lot of lifesteal, well, you're going to be in a lot of trouble once those are no longer in your deck. Temperance by far the easiest. The biggest issue with Temperant is the high damage and the sap. Well, when you have 170 base damage, a little bit of sap doesn't really hurt that much, and you're very likely to get multi-strike, a lot of rage, a lot of damage shield, and lifesteal, and all of that counters the main problems with Seraph the Temperant. Let's talk about unit synergies. Probably the best unit to pair, honestly, with the Emberdrain package build is Shadow Eater. If you have a Shadow Eater, the main thing is getting consistent morsels that are 0 cost to generate or generate from relics. And you use them exclusively to kill backline units. So you have Penumbra killing the big, heavy frontline units, and then Shadow Eater is there for cleanup. Outside of that, you can do the Crucible War and Crucible Collector. They're not as consistent as Shadow Eater, but get a multi-strike on them, and they can help as well, clearing out backline units. But again, they're not your main source of damage. You're really focusing on Penumbra, and they're there just for cleanup crew. If you end up getting one of these Gorge units, then of course pairing them with a Morsel Master or Morsel Maker just makes them that much more effective. I think if it's between Morsel Master and Morsel Maker, probably the Morsel Master is going to be better. On the one hand, it's 1 Ember, so it's a little bit easier to play, and you have then more control over what morsels you get. But Morsel Maker also helps in a pinch. I mean, you get a Morsel Maker with a Shadow Eater, that's 20 AoE every turn guaranteed, and you're healing your Shadow Eater. So definitely not a bad combo either. Moving into the spell synergies, well, the main one is the Emberdrain set. So what is the Emberdrain set? You have Perils of Production, which grants you Ember at the cost, or Ember and Rage at the cost of 2 Emberdrain. It's mostly to be used as an Ember generator. The 2 Rage honestly doesn't scale that much. Next, you have Immortal Trade. Immortal Trade, I would say, is much better early game than late game, but it can be useful for the whole run. The nice thing about Lifesteal compared to Damage Shield is that Lifesteal, especially with something like Penumbra, where it's almost guaranteed to have more attack or more damage than health, is it's a full health across all hits, where Damage Shield is really weak to multi-strike or lots of units hitting you. Void Binding, it's one of the best ones. It is nerfed a little bit. The nerf was to increase the Ember cost to 1. That does hurt it, but really you're playing Void Binding, I mean, primarily for the damage shield, but also for the Rage. I mean, 6 Rage is an extra 12 damage on a unit like Penumbra that has Trample. That adds up very fast, especially if you can get double stack on it. And that's really what you want. You want -1 cost, double stack. Now you're getting 24 damage per use and 4 damage shield. That's really enough to get through almost all floors. And then finally, the ultimate granddaddy of them all, Furnace Tap. Probably the most powerful printed card, not printed, but digital card in this game. Furnace Tap is just insane. It is the #1 best use of double stack, and it's also a good target to remove Consume. However, if you do that, then it's absolutely necessary that you can get Perils of Production more consistently so you can play it. But man, getting a single multi-strike on Penumbra turns out is really good. If you can get more than that, 2 multi-strike, 3 multi-strike, he is unstoppable. So this is the core. It's why the Emberdrain package actually works. You can do it with the others, but they all are there to support Furnace Tap, and Furnace Tap is the core part. And it's the main reason why Seraph the Chaste is also not so big of an issue. If you can get Furnace Tap, you're going to be totally fine through Seraph the Chaste. If you don't get Furnace Tap, you're probably screwed, but that's why you hope for this card to show up in both of your rare draft picks. Outside of Emberdrain, the main support are Ember generators, biggest one being Mind Collapse. You get plus 10 damage on this. 10 damage is normally enough to pick off a backline unit. Now you have 2 Ember to play something else. And Ember Cache. So Ember Cache, it does slow down your draw at the beginning, but certainly helps later on when you can get 2 Ember to deal with Blights, to be able to play Furnace Tap, to be able to play other cards. Very, very useful. And normally you need some form of Ember generation just to play out a lot of your cards throughout the run. So you should look for either Perils of Production, Ember Cache, Mind Collapse, or a combination of them. Moving into relic synergies, the top priority relic that you want to get is Mind Jacks. And the main reason why you want Mind Jacks is so that you can pick better upgrades after the flying bosses. So Mind Jacks allows you to skip getting extra capacity, and you can get draw instead. And that is super useful throughout all of the run if you can avoid having to increase capacity. If you don't get Mind Jacks, you absolutely have to take at least 1 capacity in order to play Penumbra. Luckily, I never, ever forget to do that in all of my runs. You can check. I've never once forgotten to get capacity, but I know some of you out there make that mistake all the time, so just wanted to remind you, get Mind Jacks or take capacity. Next is Refined Void. Very useful, especially in the early game where your Penumbra is much more susceptible to dying in the first few fights. Getting the Refined Void can help give you that early lifesteal to survive up until you can start really scaling Penumbra and making him stronger. And of course, all your other units take benefit from it as well, but it's primarily to keep Penumbra alive through the first rounds of combat before he's been scaled up. Chain of Gems as well fills that same slot. Get 2 damage shield onto Penumbra allows him to take a couple hits before he actually starts taking damage, and again, helping him to survive long enough to start scaling to where it's no longer a problem and he's able to deal with all the damage without any issues. When it comes to situational items, I would say the best one is the Lightstone Casing. With the nerf to Void Bindings, or Void Binding, having Lightstone Casing allows you to minus the cost, double stack, and have holdover, which is very useful to consistently get your Void Bindings. It's also fantastic on the Furnace Tap, because then you can remove Consume, double stack, and minus the cost back to 2, which becomes also very relevant for scaling Penumbra. Hell's Banners, also very useful. It does require you to have some morsel generation, but then as long as you're generating 2 morsels per turn, and that can be done with a Morsel Maker, can be done with a Morsel Master and a single morsel, or by playing 2 morsels. That's another way to generate Ember, even if you're starting at 0 cost. It's very easy to get enough spells to generate consistently 2 morsels. Forever Flame is also super useful. It allows you to start scaling your Emberdrain much earlier. One of the risks is, and oftentimes why you wouldn't play Emberdrain cards in your first turn, is that then your draft units cost too much, you can't play them out. But with Forever Flame, you can already start, because there aren't any draft units you would take with this build that are going to be more than 2 Ember cost. So this is going to make your all your Gorge units, it's going to make your Morsel Maker, your Morsel Master free, making it much easier to play them out, even if you have lots of stacks of Emberdrain. And last, we have Jack Spikes. And you might think, why would you get Jack Spikes? Well, there turns out to be a lot of 1 health units that do a lot of damage. And it's very easy, especially during fights like the second floor, taking some of the trials, or during the Daedalus fight, where they will kill your Penumbra. So having Jack Spikes allows you to put Penumbra on the second or top floor, and then none of these units ever reach Penumbra, keeping him nice and healthy for the Relentless fights. So one of the builds where I would say this is the most useful, really because keeping Penumbra alive through that early game can be a struggle without some way to take out those units, or with keeping him nice and healthy. All right, let's talk secondary units, starting with Hellhorned. Similar to a lot of the other clans, Rage synergies are really strong with the Emberdrain package. Being able to get additional damage per Rage, being able to have Rage that does not decay, getting somehow a Brute on the same floor as your Penumbra. All of these are fantastic ways to scale him even faster than normal, which is always going to be good, especially during the Seraph fight. This build is also very good with overstacking. So if you can get any demons or any of your other units, and then ascend them onto the same floor as Penumbra, can be extremely helpful to reduce units that leak through. Because even with the high damage, oftentimes your Penumbra is not able to get through all the units at once. So then having a couple of units behind Penumbra in order to clean up the rest can be very, very helpful. In reverse as well, you can also have a tank up front, put Penumbra behind. The tank or the frontline unit does a big burst of damage to the front line, and then your Penumbra is cleaning up everything else with the trample effect. Next, with Awoken, one of the best synergies with Awoken is getting quick. Using Wildwood Tome on Penumbra preserves his damage shield, preserves his health in general, and gets him 1 extra turn of Relentless combat because he'll attack before the boss does. So if you can get Wildwood Tome, it's one of the best things you can do to upgrade Penumbra. Just make sure to minus the costs so that when you have all that Emberdrain, you're still able to play it. And similar to, and you're going to see a trend of this with Hellhorned, you want to overstack. So descending units behind Penumbra, again, allows you to clear out backline units. And you can also do the reverse. You can put a tank, you put like Thorned Hollow up front, put a Penumbra behind, and your Penumbra is then protected and clearing out all of the backline units with Trample. Stygian Guard, I would say, is the hardest one to pair for this particular build because a lot of the Stygian Guard spells have high Ember costs. And Frostbite and Spell Weakness, they don't really work so well with this build. The Frostbite can kind of work in order to clear out some backliners, but Spell Weakness, I mean, you're not really doing a lot of damage with spells. All the damage spells, unless you get them to 0 cost, you can't even play them. So as I said, it's not super synergistic with the build. However, saying that, one card that is fantastic with this build is Frenzied Swarm. There are a couple reasons why. So one, Frenzied Swarm is a way to prevent damage onto Penumbra, and because you're not really needing to get units to damage you, I mean, anytime you can have a fully dazed floor, Penumbra is going to be happy. The second one is very specific to blight-based enemies, because you can actually Frenzied Swarm and then discard all the blights, as well as stun the units that are creating the blights. So you get less blights in your deck, and the ones that are in your deck you can just discard. And it's very easy to get it to 0 cost. If you get holdover on it, even better. But I would say this is the one exception where this is actually a really, really good synergy with the rest of the deck. And finally, we have Melting Remnant, one of the best utility spells. We talked about this in the last build, Resin Removal. If you have Seraph the Temperate and you have Melting Remnant as your secondary clan, hope for Resin Removal. It's going to make a huge difference with how quickly your Penumbra scales, because all that sap won't mean anything to you. The other really great thing with Resin Removal is it removes Emberdrain. So if you have holdover -1 cost on Resin Removal, you can have as many other high cost spells as you want, because in the end, every turn you can remove the Emberdrain. So instead of having to get Ember generators, you just get Resin Removal and it acts in the same way. Another really good spell utility is Engulfed in Smoke. Again, protecting Penumbra. And then the last one I'd recommend is Crushing Demise. Again, minus cost. You don't necessarily have to get holdover, but it can help. Then anything that leaks past Penumbra, or even if you want to do it before Penumbra, if you want to put Penumbra on the middle or top floor, you can clear out units to make it less likely that there are leaks, unit leaks. And as mentioned with a lot of the other builds, overstacking. So you have other options for descending. You have some great units to descend behind Penumbra as well. Anytime you can overstack a floor with Penumbra is going to be really great. And that's either putting a take up front with Penumbra behind, or vice versa, you put Penumbra up front with some extra damage behind. Okay, with that, we can jump into another example. We're going to jump into the showcase build. And again, going into the Seraph fight, just showing how this build gets set up, what are the main cards at play, and how do you make this work. Okay, with this build setup, very interesting setup. We have Penumbra, we have Morsel Master, and we have Overgorger. So the way we're going to use Overgorger in this case is we're going to play him out early with the intention to use him as cleanup crew, and if we have the chance to bring him down to the same floor of Penumbra to do extra damage. In addition, we have some imps who help with a lot of the AoE, and we have a really good combination of relics, Hell's Banners, and the Morsel Miner generator. It did mean, getting that one relic did mean that we had to play, that we had to increase capacity twice so that we could fit the Morsel Miner and Penumbra on the same floor. But in the end, it ends up being really good for us. Let's just watch the first few turns and we can kind of showcase how this build works. So we start putting Penumbra on the bottom floor. We're going to put Morsel Master on the top floor. Unfortunately, we don't get the Overgorger to take advantage right away of the Morsel Miner, but it's still okay. We're going to get the Excavated Embers into our deck for the future after we are stuck with Emberdrain. And now we have the chance to play out the Overgorger. We can also start putting Lifesteal onto our Penumbra to make sure that he's nice and healthy. And we have both Shroud Spikes already in our deck. Not really the best time for them, but it's okay. And you can see how stacked our Overgorger already is. It was quite easy. We just get low-cost Shade Splitters. We can already stack up that floor quite nicely with Hell's Banners. They're even generating Ember for us and generating card draw for us. So we're going to Shroud Spike one of them to get a whole lot of Ember. We Shroud Spike another one to get even more Ember. Double Furnace Tap the Penumbra. And the Ember from getting all of those Rebel Morsels Shroud Spiked is going to allow us to play Furnace Tap twice right at the beginning. And I think both of them are just standard Permafrost Consume Removed. I think here we're going to torch and then block with one of the Rebel Morsels. We can Molting Imp up here to save damage, and then we skip a little bit. Get both Furnace Taps in play. We do play the Molting Imp to take out the backliner, and already we're doing an insane amount of damage with Penumbra due to the Furnace taps. All right, now we're on to the 5th and final build, the Melting Remnant build. This is the Enforced Burn Bright build. So here, the champion of choice is Burn Bright 3, as in the title. The core strategy is you scale up Rector Flicker using Burnout Extenders and Paraffin Enforcer. Strength is high frontline burst and really strong relentless combat. Main weakness here is limited backline access, and it's really tough to do this build without Paraffin Enforcer. He's the main way you're scaling the Rector Flicker for this build. In terms of Seraph difficulty, Seraph the Chase is definitely the most difficult. Your build relies on the rage stacks you're getting from Paraffin Enforcer. When your rage is getting halved, it becomes really difficult to scale high enough to kill all of the units. Diligent is, I would say, moderately difficult. The big issue can be surviving, having enough burnout, and if your burnout extension spells are getting purged out of your deck, it can be really difficult to get enough burnout to keep him alive. And with Seraph Temperance, it's actually not too bad. You do lose a little bit of damage at the beginning, but then with the rage, you're scaling that up pretty well. And then during Relentless Combat, you get a lot of that sap removed anyway. And of course, the Melting Remnant have the one main card that saves you from sap, which we discussed in previous builds. Getting into unit synergies, clearly, number one unit you need for this build is the Paraffin Enforcer. He is not going to say mandatory, but it's extremely difficult to scale well without him. He is what makes your Rector Flicker become super strong. In addition, the Molten Encasement is another way to keep sustain on your Rector Flicker. You're able to extend burnout pretty easily. The biggest problem then becomes his health total. Having Molten Encasement, especially with Endless, allows you to also scale up the stealth, making it so you can get more fights or more hits during Relentless Combat before you start taking damage on the Rector Flicker. Lady of the Reformed and Lady of the House are both fantastic. Lady of the Reformed can be really good as a frontliner for that floor with Rector Flicker and Paraffin Enforcer. So you ideally want either a way to reform Lady of the Reformed or put Endless on her, and then she's able to scale up all the burnout, and all of them take advantage of the Paraffin Enforcer. And in that case, what's also really good is if you have Lady of the Reformed in the front, you can also add burnout to Paraffin Enforcer, and he will scale himself. So that can be a really good combination to get a lot of rage scaling on a single floor. And Lady of the House is just a really strong standalone unit. You can also put it in front. Biggest thing there is you need to have enough burnout extenders to cover both Lady of the House and Rector Flicker. But if you do, then it becomes really strong. Or unless you could also do a reform, have her tank all the hits, die, reform her back. And finally, Draft is actually really good in this deck. If you can get burnout extenders, consistent burnout extenders, or consistent reform, getting a Draft on the same floor as Rector Flicker and Paraffin Enforcer, all that rage is going to make him really strong with the natural multi-strike. Then all you need is either extra damage or extra multi-strikes, quick, and he becomes very strong. Getting into spell synergies, you really need burnout extenders. So that's Purifying Cleanse, Hallowed Drippings, Wicklash, and Wax and Spike. Best ones here are probably Purifying Cleanse and Wicklash. Getting Wicklash to 0 cost becomes very important so that you can play it. But getting Holdover on one of them also becomes really valuable. If you have enough of them, again, as I mentioned before, you can actually start stacking Burnout on multiple units. So Rector Flicker and the Paraffin Enforcer. So the Paraffin Enforcer starts scaling off of his own triggers. Can be really strong there. In terms of reform, you want targeted reform, so I would avoid any type of like random reform. So there you have Molded and Wicked Blaze. And my recommendation here is I wouldn't do a heavy reform, but instead do a kind of targeted safety reform. So having a Wicked Blaze or a Molded with Permafrost rather than Holdover allows you to keep it in hand until you absolutely need it on that turn. So, Rector Flicker dies, or, during Relentless phase, that floor gets wiped out. Well, then you can bring back the Rector Flicker, put it on the second floor, with additional burnout, additional health, additional damage, and that can be a way to kill the bosses even if your unit dies. So again, recommend here is permafrost, and then make sure that it's targeted so you can guarantee it's on the Rector Flicker. In addition to those spells, we have a lot of really good utility spells. Intent on Death. If you have a Molten Encasement, Intent on Death is a way to continue to scale up stealth. It's also very beneficial in other units that you might pick up throughout the run. Crushing Demise is a fantastic way to clear out unit leaks or to prep floors for your Rector Flicker 4. Dripfall, fantastic way to bring units back down who leak out. They get killed on the next floor. And it's a good way to overstack a floor. If you want to put a lot of extra burnout units on that same floor, especially if you have a Lady of the Reformed in the front, fantastic way to scale the burnout on all of them and also scale the rage because you're, with your Paraton Enforcer, getting rage on all those burnout units. Remnant Pact, especially useful for Rector Flicker, can be used in place of a reform trigger, is you can just put Remnant Pact on him, and then every time he dies, you can play him on the next floor up. And finally, Engulfed in Smoke. And that's Molten Encasement gives you stealth. Engulfed in Smoke also gives you stealth. If you double stack it, minus the 1 cost, for stealth goes a long way towards relentless fights. So very useful, very, very good spell to maintain health and also to survive Relentless phase. Now, getting into relics, we have the priority relics. Number 1 priority here is Combustible Wax. Being able to have all of your burnouts extend much further makes it a lot easier to keep your Rector Flicker alive. It really enables you to put burnout onto your Paraffin Enforcer so that he's scaling himself. Makes a lot of the survival part of this deck much, much more reliable. Then we have Exploding Candle. It's a very good way to get AoE out of your drags, out of your drafts, out of your other burnout units. If you can get like an endless tomb unit with burnout, then you're just going to do AoE damage over and over again every turn. So really good way to clear out backliners, which is one of the weaknesses of the deck. Votive Key is a great way to avoid having to do any type of reform. You use Votive Key when you play the Rector Flicker or any other priority units, your Lady of the Reformed, and then every time they're dying, you're just able to keep replaying them, keep getting that endless, and take advantage of having your units stay around forever, even if they burn out. Looking into situational, you have Waxer Snuffer. It's ideal paired with your tomb units, especially the Molten Encasement. Now you're getting 4 stealth every time it dies rather than 2. Resin Block becomes really beneficial if you are relying on any type of reform or endless, that every time they're coming back even stronger. That can be a way to scale in general. If you don't get Paraffin Enforcer, you can get endless, get Resin Block, and then just keep bringing back your Rector Flicker every time he dies, and every time he's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Melting Spout and Encased Ember kind of go together as ways to buff up your tomb units. Getting extra Ember is always going to be useful. There are some really good spells you can get out of the Melting Remnant to do either AoE damage, burst damage, or utility. Giving them high health means that they're not getting through the tomb units to damage your actual units. Okay, going into secondary clan options, starting with Hellhorned. I mean, we've talked about it a lot with all of these builds. Any type of rage combo, rage synergy is going to go really well with this build, as it relies on the rage scaling of Paraffin Enforcer. Imps can also be a great way to do a lot of support with this build. You have imps that generate rage, you have imps that generate armor, you have imps that do burst AoE damage, and getting burnout and endless on any of those imps is going to make a constant unit you can bring out, chump block with, and get an instant benefit from. Looking at Awoken, regen is actually fantastic on Rector Flicker. If you get enough burnout on him, stacking regen, he's going to live longer, be able to do more damage during relentless combat, less likely to die from earlier combat. Lady of the Reformed is also fantastic with regen. Then you don't even have to get that many burnout extenders. You just get Lady of the Reformed, you stack all this regen as she takes damage, you extend the burnout on all the units behind. Spikes also synergizes quite well with Rector Flicker or Lady of the Reformed. It can help as a way to enable backline access, backline damage. Alternatively, you can just put Thorned Hollow on a second floor, like we talked about with some of the other builds. Getting a Thorned Hollow, healing it up, Now you've got cleanup crew for everything that gets past your first floor with the Rector Flicker and Paraffin Enforcer. With Stygian Guard, you can supplement with Burst AoE. These can help clear out backline units, which is one of the major gaps in this deck. The only issue with adding a lot of the damage spells is it can make it more difficult to get to your burnout extenders. But as long as you're managing your overall deck size, you should be able to have a good balance between the spells that are clearing out the units and then the spells that are extending the burnout on your Rector Flicker and other burnout units. Totems. Getting totems on the same floor as your Rector Flicker is also extremely valuable. In particular, you want things like Armor Extension, Frostbite, or Sap. You're going to be using all these low-cost burnout spells to extend the burnout onto your Rector Flicker. Well, it turns out that that's a great way to incant a lot of these totems as well. And last, we have Umbra. Emberdrain package. It's good on most everything. It's good on Rector Flicker. The only thing to note is that if Rector Flicker dies, he loses mostly all of his buffs. So if you use Furnace Tap on him, if you're giving him Trample, if you're giving him Rage, all of that goes away when you die and when you're reformed. So just be careful. If you're going to do the Emberdrain package, you really need to make sure that he stays alive, because even if you reform him, he's going to lose a lot of those benefits that you got by stacking all of that Emberdrain related buffs onto him. And as mentioned with a lot of the other builds, stacking and overstacking is really good with this build. Space Prism, Crucible Extension can help get additional burnout units played. You don't really want to rely so much on floor movement because a lot of the burnouts you want to be able to play like immediately, not have to drop them down. And you want to play stuff in the front, which you can't do by descending. So having all that extra space allows you to put tomb units in front, allows you to put other burnout units in front to tank the hits. Also can benefit with Paraffin Enforcer, Rage on burnout units, and you can put them behind Lady of the Reformed, and she can increase all their burnout. Yeah, the only thing you have to really worry about is having so many units and so many spells that it's difficult to draw your burnout extension spells. And with that, we can go into the final highlight video. This was the first build that I showcased. It was based on a request and kind of triggered this whole idea of doing this guide, and give you a kind of example of how to play this, how to set it up with Rector Flicker and Paraffin Enforcer, and we will showcase a little bit of the Seraph fight. So again, just to set up the highlight, we are just about to play our first turn in the Seraph fight. We have Seraph the Temperant. We're going to be playing Rector Flicker. We have a Lady of the Reformed. We have Paraffin Enforcer. We have Imps. We have Reform. We have Burnout Extension. Basically the whole shebang. And at one point, I won't show it in this highlight, but we actually lose Rector Flicker, and that permafrosted Reform Wicked Blades ends up saving us. So again, we play Rector Flicker on the bottom. We're going to put Lady of the Reformed with one Paraffin Enforcer behind her. We actually have two Paraffin Enforcers. That helps out actually a lot with this deck. And we play the Fledgling Imp just to start scaling in his damage. We are going to play Umbra Stone later on. We kind of expect that Rector Flicker is going to die from all the high damage. So we're going to wait so that when we reform him, then we can play in the Trample and we're not worried about it. We also got a Deranged Brute, which helps scale all of this way faster. So as mentioned, any type of rage scaling is a fantastic combo with this build because the Paraffin Enforcer is stacking. We even got double multi-strike or two multi-strike upgrades on the Paraffin Enforcer. So the amount of rage that he gets on all these units immediately is just absolutely nuts. We can play, I think we have Dark Deal on him. Yeah, we have a lot of the cards that really make this deck quite insane, but I think we end up using Dark Deal just to clear out some units. We are going to allow our Rector Flicker to die just so that we can, again, bring him back with Wicked Blaze. So he'll die here on this turn. I said we weren't going to show it, but actually we're going to show that turn. So as soon as we play out that drag, we can end the turn. We lose Rector Flicker, but that's why we have that Wicked Blaze as a safety net so we can bring him right back and not have to worry about him dying again. Now we have all of our burnout extenders. Stack them up like crazy. We even start stacking up Wicklash onto the Paraffin Enforcer because we have more than enough burnout extenders, especially burnout extenders with holdover, that we're not really in any danger right now. And with that, we've reached the end of the guide. 5 builds to make Seraph cry. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys give these a shot. If they work for you, let me know. Make a comment below. If you think I made a huge mistake, also let me know. Again, all of the builds have a complimentary full run in the description if you want to watch how I put together the build, how I played it out all the way into the end. And hey, if you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe, and check out my other videos. On my main channel, my plan is to do more content like this in the future. If you want to see a lot of the old content, which was more just full runs, you can check out my second channel, Never Nathaniel Plus. So with that, my name is Nate. You can call me Nathan. Please never call me Nathaniel, and I will see you guys in the next video.